Hello. I've noticed over the last decade there's been a welcome surge of just outstanding writing about true crime. I think there's several reasons for this. A lot of different strains have come together. One is that there's increasing sophistication about the psychology of true crime. You go back a little bit, in 1941, you have the groundbreaking The Mask of Sanity, which for the first time in accessible language sort of explored the whole profile and characteristics of a psychopathic personality, focusing on the mask of sanity. And then in the early 60s, you had an ever more sophisticated development of the hair scale. And of course, the DSM series became a little bit more sophisticated about varieties of psychopathy and sociopathy. And finally, in the DSM-5, you just have an umbrella term, antisocial personality disorder, and which sort of covers all the cluster B disorders. And some of that has sort of leached into true crime writing. Another source of inspiration and clarity is the very fortunate fact that most of the early people who were instrumental in the developing the whole science of profiling have been immensely prolific, and in their retirement kept churning book after book. And these were books written by people who were absolutely in the thick of using human psychology, using profiling to solve real books. So that's been another sort of source of nourishment. Another thing is that there are some big books out there which have taken bold stances. One writer I absolutely love is Dr. Michael Stone, who a few years ago published something called The Anatomy of Evil, in which he famously divided evil into a sort of hierarchy of 22 different states of increasing evil. And that may seem overly schematic, but it's nothing that Dante didn't do, 600 years before. And in doing that, opens up a whole sort of dialogue about evil as a gradation of destructive behaviors. And I love his work. And his newest work, called The New Evil, has a fascinating and large section in which he looks at some new trends in crime, things like school shootings or increasingly sophisticated crimes that take new technologies and marry them with old sociopathies and have really horrendous outcomes. And just this year, the thing seems to be either organized mob sort of storming of shops and whatnot, or horrendously and way worse than that is mass shootings. And this month, it seems like there's been one every couple days, and that used to be a fairly rare event. You remember when the shooting happened, the sniper killings at University of Austin, it made front pages for months after that. Now that kind of thing seems like just par for the course. But that sophistication of argument in which he analyzes new trends in evil, tremendously welcome thing. So, there are all these different things that are feeding it. And there's also kind of a branching out, a more sensitivity of the way that different disciplines converge. The fantastic true crime writer Harold Schechter recently published a book in which he is looking, it's called Ripped from the Headlines, and he's looking at crimes that made a huge splash in the headlines and then exploring them as the sort of difference between headline representations and the actual crimes themselves, with more sensitivity of how crime is mediated to us through our news and distorted. And then there's a great big book which called, I think, Real Mysteries, which looks at various films that have been inspired by true crimes, and I think that's great. And then there's an editor recently, Mitzi Soretto, who has been doing a whole series, the best new true crime stories. And she is taking a lot of younger authors who are taking different approaches to true crime, sometimes looking at it more through the perspective of the victim, sometimes intensely involved in the psychology or iteology of an evil personality. But they seem like a lot of new voices that are sort of expanding our sense of what true crime is and what its repercussions are. There is an amazing chapter in there that examines the sort of first-person account of one of the people pinned down in Austin during the sniper shooting. And instead of focusing on the perpetrator, you have her whole life unfolded as it was impacted by that crime. And there are just a lot of trends going on. But what I want to do is look at early roots of the genre, true crime, and suggest that sometimes our current writing can be immensely enriched by looking back at the sort of history of the genre. One of the first and most interesting incarnations of a true crime genre was a play called Arden of Faversham, which has sometimes been attributed to Shakespeare. And the fact of the matter is, pretty sure that Shakespeare was just involved in it as a collaborator. This was very, very common during Elizabethan and Jacobean times. We're used to single authors, or sometimes collaborations, but in Elizabethan and Jacobean times, it was so common that there are very few plays that are just by a single author. But Arden of Faversham takes a woman married to an absolute lug, and she takes up with a lover and decides that she really wants to be with him. And it is a very, very deep, fun, lively, dark account of her strategies of dispensing with her husband. Then another thing that is fascinating and available online, something called the Newgate Calendar, where in the 18th century, 18th century, you had this absolute fascination with the most lurid details about crime, and you had publications that would look at all the capital cases at Newgate and give these terribly bloody accounts of crimes. One thing you realize is that even though in the book The New Evil, there might be a claim that, crime has changed its form. There really is nothing new under the sun. Maybe there's an acceleration of frequency, but terribly morbid and disturbing crimes have been going on forever. But more to the point, the public's sort of lurid fascination with those things has been going forever. But my absolute favorite thing I keep returning to is that even though it took modern theorists to map out in a very systematic way things like cluster B personalities and work through the subtleties of psychology and how sort of explore the etiology or development of a criminal personality over time, Shakespeare, of all people, got there first. Shakespeare is very concerned not just with describing characters who might be considered evil in some fashion. You have, most interestingly of all, Iago in Othello, who is really an architect of evil and an artist of mayhem, and in a very cunning way engages himself with everyone in such a congenial way that he's always referred to as the honest Iago. Everybody likes him, and yet totally misses the key point that while he is smiling in your face, he is plotting your absolute destruction and taking great pleasure in it. And it's a very rounded profile of an individual who is able to absolutely move invisible amongst his colleagues and friends and whatnot, and at the same time be stirring up a degree of mischief which turns the stage into a bloody killing field. Right up there is Macbeth, which is this sustained study in how far people can go in terms of psychological deterioration once they have made a decision to achieve a specific end at any cost. And you have Shakespeare not only describing them, but doing these amazing things like looking at the process by which they kill off their own empathy. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, make thick my blood, stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature step between the effect and it. Lady Macbeth is literally trying to sort of dissolve her own capacity for human empathy, make thick my blood and stop up the access and passage to remorse, that nothing gets in the way of achieving what I want. Another fascinating sort of Shakespearean twist is where in his sonnets he expresses the whole range of love and human desire, but there's only one sonnet which deals with lust, totally disengaged from love, totally disengaged with any sense of really compassion or empathy or true bonding. And it's a scary view because, as we all know, an awful lot of serial killers are lust-driven at core, and all they want is that final consummation and the total domination of that final consummation. And the murder is almost incidental to that. They just want to get away with their crime and keep getting away with their crime. And Shakespeare's portrait isn't one necessarily of a killer, but it is frightening how lust, completely disembodied from love, is potentially such a driving, manipulative, destructive thing. The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action. Let's start with that image because it's really quite interesting. He is not just talking about waste as a W-A-S-T-E, wasteland at the expense of spirit, human spirit, and a waste of shame is lust in action. No, the spirit was a slang term at the time for semen, and he is talking about a human waste, human feminine waste. So you have literally this shockingly anatomical image coming from Shakespeare in the very first line of a sonnet. The expense of spirit, expulsion of spirit, and a waste of shame is lust in action. And the whole poem revolves around this sort of distinction between the time leading up to a seduction final consummation and the feelings after that consummation. So you have the expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action. And until action, until the act itself, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, rude, extreme, cruel, not to trust. And Shakespeare never uses words without some real consideration. And that catalog of things each opens up a kind of snapshot image of different ways in which lust, unbalanced with love, can be a destructive thing. The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action, and until action, lust is perjured. Sure, people lie all the time to get what they want. Perjured, murderous, yes. Any true crime aficionado, anyone who reads headlines, realizes that there's an awful lot of murder associated with lust, disembodied from any human connection. Murderous, bloody, yep, bloody, absolutely. Crime scene, photos, sea of blood. Bloody, full of blame, yep. Savage, absolutely. Rude, seems like an understatement and backpedaling, but rude also serves as a sort of marker for a disregard of human decency, human conventions, human politeness, and the sort of protocols for living as a thriving human being within the human life world. So I will take that. Rude, extreme, yup, cruel, not to trust. And then we come to the turn where we're looking at both sides of the act. Enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight. And in a true crime sense, you see an awful lot of anger acted out, not only in the act of dominance and total dismissal of the other person, but in after it's been performed, mutilation or disregard for what remains. So the expense of spirit and waste of shame is lust in action, till action lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, rude, extreme, cruel, not to trust, enjoyed no sooner, but despised, straight, past reason hunted, and no sooner had past reason hated as a swallowed bait. And I really like this word he uses of bait, because if you read a lot of accounts of psycho killers and serial rapists, their victims are bait. They are denatured, dehumanized, removed of any sense of human dignity. So as swallowed bait, on purpose laid to make the taker mad. How often have we had serial killers say, oh, she was egging me on, as the first sort of line of defense. She was asking for it. On purpose laid to take laid to make the taker mad, mad in pursuit and in possession. So had, having, and in quest to have, extreme, a bliss in proof, and proved a very woe. Okay, Shakespeare, crime, lust disembodied from love, ardent of favor sham, domestic tragedy, domestic killings, and a surge of great books on recent crime,